Yes, hello everyone. Thanks for joining and welcome to our online Dutch Android user group meetup. So before we dive in today, I'm going to do a quick introduction about the Dutch Android user group and then I'll introduce our speaker. So here we go. Quickly about us, we're the Dutch Android user group. You can find more info about us on dutchout.org. Together with Dion, Giorgino, and Yolanda, we're the current organizers, and we have a group of over 1,300 members. I really want to put 1,400 in there, but we're 5 shy. So if you're watching this and you're not registered yet, make sure to sign up on the meetup page. We focus purely on Android, and we host free meetups. Usually we like to do it in person in Amsterdam. We pick a company and get a bunch of people together there to host 2 speakers there or some different format. But currently with COVID, we're moving everything online. So welcome here. And yeah, that's it in a nutshell. Then for more info, please visit dutchout.org. And we also have quite an active community. So you can check that out by going to dutchout.org/Slack. We have tons of people with tons of knowledge there. So if you have any questions Android related or looking for a job maybe in the Netherlands, you can always check that out. Then if you have any questions during the talk, you can use the live chat. We'll try to collect the questions as we go along. And at the end, I'll join the stream again to ask the questions in person. That's it for my introduction. With that, I will introduce Adam Bennett, who works at Cuvva, and yeah, who'll be telling us about Jetpack Compose and how we migrated to Cuvva's design system. So
great, thank you for having me.
Welcome. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. How about yourself?
Yeah, also really good. Can't complain. Yeah, before we dive into your talk, I had a couple of questions just about you before we dive into all the Android stuff. So yeah, can you tell us something about yourself? Where do we know you from? How? Quick introduction.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I'm Adam. I am based in London. I've been working in Android for around about 7 years now or so. I'm a self-taught developer. And where do you know me from? Most likely from talking on Twitter about Jetpack Compose, probably ceaselessly for a very long time. And hopefully some people have read one or two of my blogs, but that'll be where you know me. So if you know me.
Nice. Yeah, tons of good stuff there. So you mentioned you got into Android development about 7 years ago, self-taught. How did that start? What happened that made you want to learn Android development?
Yeah, it's funny actually. I used to be really into the sort of custom ROM scene, CyanogenMod and that kind of thing back in the day. And the main reason for that was I was really frustrated about the fact that I had a Samsung Galaxy S2, and the rollout of Ice Cream Sandwich was so slow that the only alternative to get the shiny new Android features was to root your phone. And so I kind of got into it that way, and I wanted to kind of give back to that community that I'd kind of learned a lot from. And the obvious first step, rather than compiling your own version of AOSP, was to start doing some Android development. Yeah, and then I basically taught myself how to program. I did the very first Android Coursera course that was sponsored by the very first one, which was it was quite good. It had the difficulty really ramped up. I think there was a big section about content providers, which I don't remember. But after that, I was really lucky. I managed to land a sort of 6-week internship at a company called Flypay, who did payments in the fintech space in London. And 6 weeks after that, they hired me as a junior and got a ton of mentorship. And that really kind of put me on the right path. So yeah, that's how I got into it. Custom ROMs. So.
Nice, exciting. Yeah, I've been there too. I remember my HTC device that was running Gingerbread, or was it? I really wanted the latest and greatest, so I think we all went there back in the day. Exciting times. So.
Yeah.
I remember loving
for sure.
and getting all these new features. Really cool.
And bricking it with nightlies. Yeah, that was the less fun experience, but yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And we're of course a Dutch Android user group. Have you ever visited the Netherlands, or what's your favorite spot in the Netherlands?
I have very briefly, and it's probably not really going to count, but I spent a couple of weeks in Germany, Oddly enough, on a US tank base, and at one point we went and visited a war memorial just over the border. So I've been in Holland for I've been in the Netherlands, sorry, for approximately 2 hours. That's about the sum of it. So
yeah,
doesn't really count as a good experience.
You were here. Next time, maybe visit Amsterdam, or visit one of our meetups in person.
It's on the list. I think, once we're allowed to leave the country, then it's on the list for sure. So
fingers crossed. All right, cool. That's a couple of quick questions from my side. With that, I just want to give you the word, and I'll join you back after the stream with some questions from the audience.
Great, awesome. Great, fantastic. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. So this is migrating your design system to Jetpack Compose. My name is Adam. I've been working at a company called Cuvva for about 1.5 years, and we started looking seriously at how to migrate to Jetpack Compose about 1.5 years ago. So we've put quite a lot of thought into this, and which is why I've been talking about it a lot recently. I just wanted to share some of those experiences with you, and hopefully that will kind of cross over to what you're doing. What we'll talk about is, we'll start off with what exactly is a design system, what does our system look like, what problems are we trying to solve that we think Jetpack Compose can solve for us. Planning your approach. It's a big migration. How do you kind of discover these problems early? How do you bring the team up to speed? The actual migration itself, how do you start switching things across? How do you start measuring results and making sure that everything is reliable? And then tips, tricks, and advice, bits and pieces that we kind of learned along the way. So that's that. So we'll start off with the design system stuff. So a design system is a collection of reusable components guided by clear standards that can be assembled together to build any number of applications. The vast majority of companies have some kind of design language, and these design systems vary enormously in terms of complexity. You may be at a company where you just have a handful of custom views. You might have something like a button with a loading spinner in it, and maybe a couple of others, or you might go all the way up to a kind of Veru scale, 5 engineers on it permanently, distributing design systems through Maven and stuff like this. And at Cuvva, we're somewhere between the two. I think we're pretty ambitious on the design system front, but there are only 5 of us in total, so we haven't got a sort of dedicated resource on it. But hopefully some of the stuff that we've learned will carry over regardless of the kind of scale of your system. So a kind of sneak peek into what our design system looks like. This is a screenshot design system app. And this is a page that has all of our typography on it. These are what we call tokens. So these are the very smallest unit of our design system. Things like your typography, things like colors and dimensions. Here you can see we've got the branding colors on the left, and then we've got the more semantic colors, which you should be fairly familiar with the material design spec, on the right. And we use these tokens as like a core building block of everything that we create. Here we have buttons on the left, and fabs on the right. These are what we call primitive components, and they're the kind of smallest displayable unit of our design system. And these are used absolutely everywhere, as I'm sure you can imagine. There's probably hundreds and hundreds of references to buttons throughout the entire app. And then used a lot less frequently, we have what we refer to as compound components, and these are typically built up of several primitive components. So the left one here is what we call a simple button bar, and this is just a surface with a button in it, maybe multiple buttons depending on the mode that it's in. And on the right, we have something called an interactive submission view. They say that in computer science, the hardest thing is naming. It's not a very catchy name. But you can see it's made of an icon with a background, a clickable icon, piece of text, couple of buttons. So we compose all these things together to create reusable sections of UI and a sort of cohesive design language. What does this look like in code? So this is a snippet of our design module. So we have, I think, 70 odd modules now. or design focused, and you can see we've gone with an individual module per view. And we invested really heavily in modularization. I'll kind of cover why a little bit later. Notice at the bottom, Design Core and Design Core Compose. We've deliberately kept these very, very separate, and I'll go into that a bit later as well. So what does this look like practically? So this is a real snippet of our button view code, and immediately it's kind of terrifying. It's not very nice to look at. We've got this JVM overloads constructor for dealing with different versions of Android. We extend constraint layout. We're using inheritance over composition because you're forced to by the view system. We have this enum mode, which dictates what one looks like ultimately. And as you can imagine, stuff like this is really quite painful. So each time we try to create a component like this, you will typically have a file for the view itself. You'll have a file for the attributes. You'll have a file for the layout, depending on the complexity. You'll have a file for the data binding adapters, should you have invested in that, which we did. And then we also use Kotlin flows to deal with clicks. So we have a file for the adapters as well. So you're talking about 5 separate files just to create a simple component like a button, and it's pretty painful. But apart from that, I think views is pretty well established. They are stateful. This view is aware of what mode it's in. Styles and themes are complex and they're not type safe. It's very easy to use a theme overlay where you're meant to use a style or vice versa. And we also found that compile times are really, really long. And this was partly our fault because we did invest in data binding. And we found that our compile times were kind of getting out of hand, and Compose should make a difference there as we start to replace this stuff. So yeah, we decided a year and a half ago that we would architect our app based around the assumption that Compose is coming. And we decided that we wanted to be early adopters. We were okay with the pain of early adoption. And for us, this looked like architecting in terms of MVR, heavy modularization, and using this design app. So that's that. So you've seen a lot of stuff about Jetpack Compose. You've decided you're kind of sold on it. You decided you want to use it at work. Where do you start? And the first place to start with is really planning your approach, because these things are really big refactors. And if you only take one takeaway from this talk, the one that I most is creating a design app if you haven't already. So a design app acts as a separate testing playground and a showcase for your design work, but it gives you a place where you can really rapidly iterate on designs. If you're building design components specifically, you don't want to have to dig into the section of the app which might be buried away in a flow where you're actually utilizing this. So it shortens that feedback loop for you. But it also serves as a safe space to kind of experiment with Jetpack Compose. This image here is a kind of naive interpretation of our sort of module dependencies. So on the left, we've got our design app, and on the right, we've got the main Cuvva app, the one that actually pays the bills. And obviously, both apps depend on the design modules. You might start off by integrating some Compose directly into your design modules, but the chances are you're going to end up breaking something in the main app. And there's a few reasons for this. Modules for Jetpack Compose to work, it uses the Kotlin IR, so the Kotlin Intermediate Representation system, which is a technically not yet stable part of the Kotlin compiler backend. And this, because it's unstable, you probably don't necessarily want it in your main app. But you'll find that when you compile apps that generate IR code, they can only be consumed by other modules that also have IR enabled. So if you're not careful, if you do something like this, you will end up sort of infecting the entire app with IR modules, and you'll find all kinds of strange bugs. We found that adding Compose, we found that adding the runtime broke all of our lifecycle related tests, which was a slightly strange one. It turned out we were doing something slightly incorrect there, so it wasn't a net bad thing. We found that it didn't work with Kotlin synthetics. We had to migrate away from those. we found that it didn't work with the specific version of Kotlin we were using at the time when we started to integrate. And we had to migrate the parcelize annotations to serializable. So we had to give up some performance there as well. So the idea with this design app is that you separate the two, and it gives you this kind of safe space to be able to experiment with this stuff without the potential of breaking the app that pays the bills. And it lets you work on this migrating your design system across in parallel. And then you can integrate this stuff later on when you're a bit happier with the stability and you've kind of proved that everything works. The other benefit of this is, unfortunately, Compose is pretty tied to the Arctic Fox version, the Canary version of Android Studio, and you don't necessarily want to use that one in production either. One of the implications of this is you need to migrate your local JDKs and your ones in CI to Java 11 rather than Java 8. And this can be a little bit painful as well, and you might experience side effects that you didn't expect. So having this design app allows you to use the alpha versions of the tools and play with that stuff there, and then use the stable ones for the app that actually keeps the company running. So highly recommend this. So create a design app. Next, what you want to do is get your team on board. And we did this with a so ultimately, you know, by being at a talk like this, chances are you've probably had a play with Jetpack Compose already. But the reality is probably the majority of people in your team haven't played with this sort of beta cutting edge library yet. And that's absolutely fine. I think these people probably have a better work-life balance than you or I. But this is a chance, a sort of company sanctioned time paid for it. And it gives everyone the chance to kind of learn together and to sort of inject some excitement into what is in reality quite a big refactor. So what I'd recommend doing is pulling together some learning resources. We created a Google Doc that had a link to a bunch of stuff that we found interesting. The Compose pathway is a really good gentle introduction. We had a bunch of videos in there that we thought were interesting, and just links to resources basically. And I'm more than happy to share that with people if they want. It's part of the overall schedule for the hack day. So if anyone wants that, just message me and I will send it. So pull all that stuff together and then spend the morning learning at your own speed. So everyone clocks in for the day and they spend the first 2 or 3 hours just going through this learning resource and working at their own speed. Some people will have played with Jetpack Compose and they'll understand what's going on and they'll want to mess around with maybe state or animations or that kind of thing. And for some people, it will literally be the first time they've ever laid eyes on Compose code. But give them a little bit to kind of digest some of these resources. What we did after this was we had a brief lunch get together where we chatted over things and people got to clarify things if they had any questions. And then we spent the afternoon hacking. So start building things. And what I would say is maybe temper your expectations a bit in terms of what you can build. I think a lot of people will kind of launch into this and try to replicate something like the Spotify UI or something fairly ambitious. But for a lot of people, you know, Compose is a completely new paradigm, completely new APIs. If you just manage to create a page with a button on it that increments the counter, then that's a really good achievement if you've never looked at it before. But this is some dedicated time to do this coding. We found that pairing was really, really good for this. Some of the more experienced people pairing with some of the less experienced people worked really, really well. And if you're the person who is the most experienced with Jetpack Compose in the team, I also recommend making yourself available the whole afternoon. So I hung out in a Google Hangout all day and people could just drop in when they had some questions. And it worked really well. And we had all kinds of really interesting discussions and it helped kind of unstick people who were unsure of something or couldn't figure out why they were trying to do one thing and it was behaving the other way or that kind of thing. Once you've done this, have a bit of a show and tell the next day. If people have got things they want to show, that's great. People may not be comfortable with showing some of the very basic stuff that they've done, and that's absolutely fine too. But the thing you really want to do is discuss the experience with your team. Discuss the pros, cons, discuss what they enjoyed, what they didn't. Did they run into any blockers? Are there any kind of concepts that they really struggled with? And that kind of thing. And this resulted in some of the most fun conversations I think I've had in my team to date. It was really interesting, and everyone was really excited and came up with all kinds of wild ideas and questions. It was great. Yeah, and credit to Snap Mobile for this idea. Some of the people at Snap Mobile talked about this quite publicly on Twitter, and I pinged some of them, and I was like, "Can I steal this idea?" And they were fine with that. So, but I highly recommend doing this. So you got the team on board. So I would also use this as a chance to think about decoupling things, think about separation of concerns. One of the things that we realized is that a lot of our existing UI relied on things that it probably shouldn't. So our UI was relying on things like domain classes, maybe a little bit too much logic. And this is a chance to really revisit that and keep the UI light and decoupled, basically, and invest in modularization if you haven't already. Think about your data flow. So Jetpack Compose pushes you towards a unidirectional data flow. And it's worth considering how difficult is this going to be for you to manage. If you're already using MVI, you're going to find it a breeze. If you're using MVP or something along those lines, you might find it's a little bit clunky. And you don't really want to start creating a ton of composables and then get to the actual integration phase and go, actually, this is quite clunky. I don't really know how to hook these things up. Can you create an adapter layer in the meantime? Would that be enough? So it was one of the things you want to think about. Consider testing. Testing on Android views historically has been a bit painful, and it's a bit easier on Compose. And it's one of the things that is worth reconsidering. I'll talk about this a little bit later. And consider gathering metrics as well, tracking your progress as a way of keeping stakeholders up to date and that kind of thing, giving the team something to aim for. And I'll talk about that a bit later as well. So when you actually start writing code, porting your theme across is probably the most kind of foundational aspect. It's really what everything else is built on top of in Jetpack Compose, and it's fairly important to get that right. And one of the things you want to think about is your design system simple enough to adhere fully to the material design spec, or do you need something a bit more custom? The chances are that it's custom. It's even with the best will in the world, you're unlikely to adhere to material 100%. And if that's the case, then how do you kind of integrate that into Compose itself? So this is typically how you would declare a theme, and it's a wrapper around the material theme object itself. And we have this simple if-else statement, and you have these factory methods that create the light colors or the dark colors. And I've just realized logically that these are switched. That is a bug. But you have these two factory methods, and these just create these colors objects, which are defined in the material components. And like I said, they're quite simple, pretty familiar to a lot of us, but the chances are your design system might be a bit different. All you need to do is just create a new data class. So we created one called Cuvva colors. And as you can see, it's far bigger. It's got a lot more semantic colors in it. I think in total it has nearly 25 or so colors. And you'll use this to define your color palette for your app. And then you simply slot it into your theme. But obviously here, this is where it all falls apart. And this is because the type is totally different. So you need some way of providing this to your to the rest of your app. And we do this using a composition local, which is a slightly scary name. But all we do is we create this top-level theme object. You hang a colors property off it, and then you delegate the getter to this local colors object. And that is basically how you make the colors available sort of anywhere within your app. So a composition local is basically a sort of service locator within a tree. And it's a way of avoiding passing this colors object the whole way down your theme. You don't want to have to pass it where you set content down to the leaves at the very bottom. So this is a way of just kind of picking it up from wherever within that tree. And And then within your theme itself, you just use this composition local provider, and you say that this local colors composition local that you've defined provides semantic colors. And semantic colors in this case is just your colors object. And it's really as easy as that. If this is at all unclear, the Compose examples, the Jetpack example has exactly this. So we lifted it completely from there. It's super, super easy. But you can use this to provide all kinds of things. It's not just limited to colors. We use it to provide typography. We use it to provide elevation and shapes. And we're considering using it to provide strings. One of the things that we've thought about is in Jetpack Compose, you can use string resources just like you would within a view-based system. But string resources are an implementation detail of the Android system. And if you wanted to make your composables agnostic of the system, you can use this composition local provider pattern to delegate to a platform-specific implementation. So if you wanted to support desktops, for instance, or eventually when iOS support comes, doing this would be a pretty good way of doing that. So we haven't done it yet, but it's just one of those things we're investigating. Lastly, you'll notice these debug colors. These are some defaults which are obnoxiously bright. I think they're bright magenta on our design system. You'll see this in the Jetpack app as well. And this is basically a sort of simple way of making sure that you don't accidentally use components that don't adhere to your design system. And for an example of this, here we've got a material button, and by default, it uses the material theme.colors.primary color. If you wrap this in your custom theme and you've got debug colors enabled, it will be immediately obvious that you've forgotten to theme the specific component, and it means that it doesn't catch you out later on. So here, what we've done is we've wrapped it in the cover theme, and then we've said we're going to use the go action here, which is just a green call to action, basically. But we're good developers, we're responsible developers. We don't want to be doing this for every single button. We don't want to be caught out by this theming issue, by the debug colors. So what we do is we wrap it in a composable, and there we go. We've created our first design system component. But we've actually done something really interesting here, which we've basically hidden an implementation detail of our design system. In this case, we're delegating to the material design library. But if we wanted to, we could switch this out across the entire app with something completely custom. If we want to build from a surface from scratch, we want to add some fancy animations, just by providing this this abstraction over the top, you've moved material to this implementation detail. And Nick Butcher talks about this in a video called Compose by Example. But basically, Jetpack Compose builds on top of each previous layer. So the UI elements build on top of the runtime, Foundation builds on top of UI, and the material design library is built on top of Foundation. It's a design language over the top. The chances are that your design system is going to be another abstraction again on top of the material design components, but it doesn't have to be. You can replace it completely. If you want something totally custom, something which is very much sort of not Android standard, then you can replace material completely. There's a couple of benefits to this. One of the benefits that we found is that because we were using Jetpack Compose during the alpha stages, the API was changing a lot, and providing this abstraction over the top meant that any API surface changes were relatively minimal for us, and it's a good way to kind of guard against fluctuating APIs. It's less of a problem now that Jetpack Compose is in beta, but the chances are some aspects of the API will change. So this helps you guard against that. You also don't have to make this decision globally. You can pick and choose for individual components. If you decide you need more control for a floating action button because you want to do some fancy animations, you can totally do that, and you can rely on Foundation. But for everything else, you can use the material libraries. And this is the composable nature of Jetpack Compose. You get to pick and choose between them. For what it's worth, we decided to largely build on top of material. There's a couple of places where we build on top of Foundation, but we've hidden material completely. So it shouldn't be possible to use any material composables within our app. With that in mind, one small gotcha that we found, this is the text composable from the material library, and it uses color.unspecified. This is a bit of a gotcha. If you're not paying attention, you can end up filling your app with these text composables, and then when you change your theme, you might realize that all of these suddenly don't reflect your theme. And again, this is just a good example of why you probably want to wrap this API and provide your own text composable that delegates to your implementation of the theme. Great, so you've ported your theme across, you created some of these components, and now is the time to consume one of these components to test that it works and it doesn't break anything in production. So we've got our button compose, it's part of our design compose library. And what we want to do is attempt to integrate this into the existing app. And probably the best thing to do here, one of the things that we did was choose a code path that is not critical and integrate just one composable in that specific place. So you probably don't want to go into your Android application and replace the Pay Now button with a composable, because that's maybe a bit too high risk for you. But in some non-critical path, maybe the About section of the app, maybe replace a button there, check that everything compiles correctly. And if you're really worried, do an A/B test to make sure that it doesn't affect any users clicking of these buttons, but also it doesn't cause increased crash rates or that kind of thing. But keeping this integration small means that if you find that it breaks anything, you can easily remove this. It's not a big problem, and then you can continue working on your design system while you fix the outstanding issues in your main app and get it prepared for integrating Compose. And like I said, we found quite a few different cases where Compose would break bits and pieces. I think it's less of a problem these days, but certainly when we started messing around in November, we found a few different issues which were blockers. So once you're happy, you can start replacing more and more of these components. Here is a snippet of some XML for one of our compound views. Remember, a compound view is made up of smaller subcomponents. And what we've done is we've switched out a button for a Compose view. This Compose view is the bridge between the Compose world and the Android view world. And you integrate it like this. So in the screenshot on the right there, you can see this Manage Subscription button. This is part of a wider card called a subscription view. And all we do is we get a reference to this Compose view, and then we call set content on it like you would with any other layout, basically in Jetpack Compose. And we found that this worked absolutely seamlessly. We're really yet to find an issue with it. Switching from dark theme to light theme, stuff like this all worked absolutely fine. We didn't find any weird UI glitches. But integrating it in this fashion, we knew that this was being able to access this was somewhat of an edge case. So we knew it was relatively low risk. And it let us kind of check that in production, nothing was broken. But this process where you get a Compose view and set content, this is exactly the same whether you're doing it whether you're doing it inside a custom view to replace the content of that view in a fragment or in an activity. It's all the same process. If you want to go the other way around, you can pass legacy views into composables. And here we have the Android view composable. And what we're doing is we're calling the constructor of the My Button view. And then within this Lambda, you're able to apply some configuration to that view. And it's really as simple as that. And again, we found this to be completely seamless. Excuse me. We have a page in the app which is very complex. It's made of dozens and dozens of composables. But we've also integrated several design components from our legacy library this way as well. And yeah, we're yet to find any problems. It's worked fantastically well. So which strategy do you use? Do you work from the outside in, wrapping your custom views in Compose? Or do you work from the inside out, creating these composables and wrapping them inside existing views? So we thought about it a lot, and unfortunately, there is no one correct answer to this. It's highly contextual, and the answer is really up to you. It depends how you approach the migration. What I would recommend is doing this piece by piece. I wouldn't recommend doing it in a kind of sweeping manner. If you do create a brand new button composable, that's referenced in 100 places, you probably don't want to go through and replace all of these in one go. You're asking for trouble. And ultimately, from a company perspective, it doesn't really achieve anything. You haven't really improved anyone's experience. So I would recommend against doing that. With that in mind, it does mean that your legacy design system and your Compose one will exist side by side. And it does mean that you have these two disparate design systems to maintain. That's absolutely fine. And that will be the case for a number of months while you do this migration. Just bear it in mind. It's another thing to maintain. So testing. Testing is an interesting topic. So in the same way that you wouldn't download a car, we're responsible developers, and you wouldn't refactor legacy code without a test harness. Typically, when we refactor, we extract an interface, we write tests to discover what the current behavior is, and then assert that the newly refactored behavior matches the legacy behavior. And it turns out you can do this for UI as well, using a strategy called screenshot testing. As you're rewriting your design system, use this as an excuse now that it's so much easier to test your new design system. There is a library for this called Shot by a company called Kurumi, and it enables pretty easy screenshot testing. And it looks a little bit like this. So you extend screenshot test, you've got your Compose test rule there. And what you're able to do is the Compose interop using Android View is actually so good that you're able to use Compose to create a test harness around your legacy design system, around your legacy views. And you're even able to write espresso assertions on top of this, despite being inside a composable tree, which is kind of crazy. So if you want to, you can write those assertions, check that hello world is visible. But the real magic happens here, where we call compare screenshot. And what this does is it sets a baseline. It takes a screenshot, and that screenshot is now the standard to which your composables have to match. So once you've done this, you're able to create your composable version. You're able to slot this into the test, and then you run it again. And what Shot does is it compares these two screenshots side by side, and it will highlight the areas where you have missed something and something isn't pixel perfect. If you don't need it pixel perfect, it does have a sensitivity value, and I suspect you'll argue with your design team over whether it should be pixel perfect or not. But it's really, really powerful. And what I'd recommend as well is don't just test the very basics. Test every permutation if you can. Test how. So here we're testing a very long string, and you want to double check that your legacy button and your new composable react in the same way. Do they wrap text, or do they break into separate lines? And it lets you work out the discrepancies between your new system and your old one. And then in doing this, you get to decide, okay, well, this is an acceptable trade-off, or you know what to look out for when you start integrating things, and where it might potentially break existing views, or existing views might have to change. If you did choose to write espresso assertions, replacing these with the Compose ones is really easy. The API is pretty similar. It's a bit less verbose. There's a lot less nesting, and it's just as fluent. If you already have a strong suite of espresso assertions, there is some good news, which is that the espresso team are working on Jetpack Compose support. So you may want to put off doing this until that support is ready. I'm not sure what the timeline is for that exactly. But yeah, the point is you should be able to keep those assertions, refactor and switch out your implementation for a Compose one. And right, onto the tips. So composables are cheap. And what I mean by this is they are cheap to create and they're cheap to run. And this is very much at odds with the existing view system. So it takes a tiny bit of getting used to. Here we have a button, which takes a background color and a text color. And sensibly, we've passed the primary color to the background and a text on surface color to the text color standard. But we've made a copy paste error. We've accidentally put text on surface in twice. And then suddenly your text isn't visible, you don't know what's going on, and it's a pain to debug. Stuff like this is really silly, and it depends basically on how permissive you want your APIs to be, but I would probably recommend making it so that it's harder to misuse your design system. And all we do is, well, actually, you've got a couple of options. You could do clever scoping if you wanted to. You could use nested colors within your design system, but we decided against it. It would probably get out of hand quite rapidly. But like I said, composables are cheap. Why not make this a private implementation detail, push it down, and create a primary button variant of your composable? And this means that there's no way to misuse this. There's no way to accidentally make something which is an invalid choice according to your design system. And it hides complexity from the caller. And ultimately, you wouldn't do this with a design system typically. You would pass attributes to a custom view. But in Compose, you wouldn't think twice about creating a variation of a suspending function. And Compose is functionally largely the same thing. So don't be afraid to create lots of them. The downside is that you end up with an explosion of composables, and this can be not particularly discoverable. So we've been trying this system where we create a top-level object, in this case a button, and this gives you an API which is like this, button.primary, button.secondary, and it's worked pretty well. It means that it's pretty easy to work out all the different variations of some design component that you've created. And I know some other teams are doing this. I think Decathlon said that they're doing this recently as well. But it's just a way of kind of organizing things that we've quite liked. Yeah, and composables are cheap to run as well. So within Compose, it's a bit of a sea change, but heavily nested layouts are absolutely fine, with the caveat if you're not doing any measuring. So historically, we've been very careful about deeply nested view hierarchies because of how the view system works. That you want without really thinking too much about performance, unless you have some kind of custom layouts that do a whole bunch of measuring. Chances are that you won't. And this means that for a long time, your default when approaching creating new pages on Android has been reaching for constraint layout. Typically, you won't really do this in Jetpack Compose. I would recommend people against immediately reaching for constraint layout, because the chances are that you can create something which is easier to understand just by using these combinations of rows and columns. So yeah, don't immediately reach for that. And metrics. So metrics are an interesting one. Metrics give you concrete proof of progress, and this is useful for a couple of different reasons. So it can help motivate and kind of push your team. So when you see that you've reached the 20% compose barrier, the 50% compose, or when you see you've only got 10 custom views left to get rid of, that can really help give your team a bit of a push to kind of cross that finish line and finish this big refactor, something which could otherwise be a bit of a slog. But it can also be used to show management that you are making real progress, real measurable progress, even when they're not seeing changes within the app. And this is a general pro tip for any big refactor which doesn't have sort of immediately user visible output. If you can measure at the very least the progress that you're making, but also some other metric that it improves, that this refactor improves, it's a really, really good way to get buy-in and have people not wonder, what are they spending all their time on, because I don't see any changes in the app. So that's what we did with Compose. We looked at it and we figured Compose basically replaces all of your layouts, all of your custom views, all of your themes, styles, colors, and dimensions. And so we track this using some pretty hacky bash scripts. And we use GitHub Actions to dump this into a Google spreadsheet once a week. I'm more than happy to share these scripts as well. Please ping me on Twitter if you're interested in them. I might write about them at some point, but they've been pretty useful to us. We also talked about tracking build times using Gradle Profiler because, like I said at the beginning, we figured that Compose would probably make a difference to our compile times. And truthfully, we never got around to doing this. It kind of fell by the wayside. I think if we had a dedicated infra team, which we will by the end of the year, then we probably would have done this. But instead, I've been running it manually every now and again, and the results are pretty inconclusive at the moment. But it's fairly early days. just to share the most recent results. So you can see here the blue line, we've got over 500 layouts. And you can see the orange line at the bottom. This is roughly how many fully composed layouts we have, and it's about 10. But the interesting thing is you can see here, back in November, we started adding bits and pieces. This is when we started adding the themes. And you can see in kind of end of January, this is when we decided that it was stable enough and we wanted to kind of go the whole hog. And since then, it's been growing kind of exponentially. The other one that's interesting is the yellow line for custom views. Notice how it's completely stable. We haven't removed any custom views. And like I said, this is because we haven't gone through and just replaced every instance with a composable. When we do change something, we only change something when it's relevant. Yeah, it's just evidence that you will have these kind of parallel design systems for a little bit of time. So bear that in mind. Great. So yeah, to summarize, basically Jetpack Compose, it's worth investigating now. It's much more stable than you think. The tools maybe less so. So definitely explore in parallel and think about how you might start tackling this migration. And if you do it in parallel, it gives you that chance to work on something meaningful rather than just waiting to kind of be unblocked with other dependencies. Approach it with a plan. It's a really big refactor. So do think about how you're going to achieve it. Get your entire team involved and up to speed. Use it as a chance to overhaul your design system. So separate concerns where it makes sense, write tests where it makes sense, create a design app if you haven't already, and integrate that design app in part of your sort of product design engineering feedback flow. It's really, really valuable. And one thing to think of, one thing to consider as well, if you do keep your composables clean of things like domain dependencies and Android implementation details, could you distribute this as a desktop app now that Jetpack Compose supports this? Could you end up in a situation where your design team get to look at Figma, but also the design app that you've distributed on their desktop and compare things side by side? Is worth thinking about. Where are we at? We're still in relatively early stages. Like I said, we've got about 10 pages that are using Compose, but we do use Compose in production, and we're shipping a very big feature, which is partially written in Compose next week. All new features are written in Jetpack Compose, and we're migrating old pages when it makes sense. When we're making significant changes, that's time for us to overhaul things. We learned a ton about big migrations. We learned a lot about mitigating risk, working with fluctuating APIs, how to measure results, and hiding implementation details. We're really, really enjoying it. This is probably the headline. We're enjoying a new challenge. We're enjoying a new way of thinking about things. And the results are really promising. We're finding that we're able to ship more complex pages and things that we would never think about shipping previously, animations and this kind of thing, really, really rapidly. In that vein, it's been a huge success for us. And expect more content from us. We've been talking about it a lot. We'll probably talk about it a bit more. But we're planning on open sourcing our design library sometime in Q2. It's one of my immediate priorities after some hiring stuff as soon as Q2 starts. And we will also likely open source our unidirectional data flow architecture as well, more towards Q3. This is sort of flow-based, and it's got a really interesting sort of Jetpack Compose adapter layer that makes passing events to our view models really, really easy. So look out for that, and that will be at github.com/Cuvva. That's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate I've touched on a ton of stuff here. I've written about this in pretty great detail on my blog. There is more to come. I think I'm going to follow up with a sort of FAQ type article. A lot of people have the same kind of sticking points, so look out for that. But yeah, happy to answer any questions. And if you have any questions at all or want to reach me, Twitter is by far the best place to get my attention, and I'm more than happy to nerd out over Jetpack Compose with new people. So thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your talk. That was really great. I love the idea of the hack day, and
you.
also the screenshot testing looks so nifty and easy. At least you made it look easy, so that's really good. Yeah, with that,
it's actually fairly tricky to integrate, but it's valuable, I think. So yeah.
cool. With that, we got a couple of questions. Let me see. One question by Jofje. In regards to the theme's interoperability, there is some Compose theme adapter from Google. Have you checked it out or considered it in your code base?
We haven't really, no. I think because our existing style system was so complex, it wouldn't really have afforded any advantages to us. I think if you can go that route, if you have got a fairly strict kind of material app, it will save you that trouble that I was saying about of sort of maintaining two parallel design systems. So it can be pretty valuable in that regard. But I think if you've got anything at all custom, it kind of doesn't really work. Certainly doesn't work for us, unfortunately. So.
Clear.
Plus, we figured eventually we'd have to go the fully custom route anyway, so we decided we'd do it sooner rather than later. So
might as well.
Yeah.
Cool. So then you also mentioned like Compose for iOS. Someone was wondering how confident you are that Jetpack Compose will come to iOS. Can you tell us? Do you have any ideas about that? Or
I don't know. I would be very surprised if the JetBrains team weren't working on it. I think, obviously they brought out the desktop support. Under the hood, Compose and desktop, the desktop version, they both sort of delegate to a skier implementation, which is totally doable on iOS. So I'd be very surprised if they didn't. I think Kotlin multi-platform in terms of sharing data has been a huge boost to a lot of teams. I think it's one of the few kind of cross-platform frameworks that makes a lot of sense, and we've been investigating it ourselves. So I'd be shocked if they didn't. I mean, I would love for it to happen this year, but I don't know. Suspect it might take a little bit longer than desktop support. So
fingers crossed. Let's see.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Then another question: what are you naming your layouts in Compose? Is there any convention to follow, or is just layout okay? And specifically, he doesn't like the layout suffix. Do you have any?
The layout suffix.
Yeah,
that's a good question. Typically, we call them screens, I think. But we haven't been particularly rigid on. It's one of the few aspects of the design system we haven't been mega rigid on. And how we organize those composables for that specific feature, we aren't too strict on actually. But I think typically we use screens at the top level. So set content, such and such a screen. And then underneath that, you'll reference the design system itself. But don't tend to use layout for that. So. Cool.
I'm going to quickly browse the live chat. You're getting a lot of compliments, by the way. So big props there.
Oh, nice. Good.
Let's see. When you define custom composables for buttons, do you have any tools in place to prevent usage of the default button?
Well, but I mean, basically, we don't allow you to rely on the material library. So that's the main thing. There, I believe there's actually I can't remember. There may be a button implementation in the foundation layer. I don't believe there is actually. But what we do is when you create a new module using Jetpack Compose, you import the design library, you import the components that you want. Those will delegate to material. But we don't allow you to rely on the material dependency. So you shouldn't be able to, in theory. So.
Nifty. Nice. Cool. Then, did you get much pushback from the company?
No, we didn't actually. It's an interesting question. I think we're pretty lucky at Cuvva generally. I think I said that when I joined, pretty much when I joined was when we started thinking about Jetpack Compose, and this was because basically the Android app had gotten to a state where it was largely unmaintainable, and we were given a large period of time to really think about how we would scale our architecture and what we wanted to achieve and how we would do that. which is super cool. I've never worked in a company that has done that and given us that freedom. But I think, I think the results from that are really starting to show. I talk about sort of compounding interest a lot. If you can afford to spend a little bit of extra time on each feature that you're working on, to do a bit of kind of cleaning up and a little bit of optimizing, that kind of thing, you shouldn't hit this point where suddenly you can't add new features. And that was kind of what we sold it as. And one of the values of the Cuvva team at Android is that we never knowingly write code that will slow us down in the future. And yeah, the company is pretty behind us on that, and we're very lucky to have that. But like I said, I think a lot of companies probably won't be as understanding. But this is where collecting metrics to kind of prove that you're actually doing things, if you can prove that it improves the developer experience, whether that is by tracking compile times, whether it means tracking the number of bugs that you see, or that kind of thing, it can be a way of selling that. And I think Hans Dorfman tweeted the other day saying, one of the benefits of adopting Jetpack Compose now in a small company is you get to be on the kind of bleeding edge, and you get to be a company that other people want to work for. If you're seen as a company that's doing this, there's a lot of advantages. And if you can sell it as that, if you can sell it as, it'll speed up delivery time, it will reduce the number of bugs, it will reduce the time that we think about fragmentation, and it will allow us to attract really good talent, then that should be a relatively easy conversation to have, I would have thought.
Yeah, sounds super valuable. Nice. Let me see, what else do we have? A couple more questions. Are you using @Preview or Airbnb Showcase as tooling support? I found @Preview to be very buggy and or slow despite a beefy machine, even with the recent updates.
Yeah, it's a good question. This is where the design app really shines, because we get quick feedback. But yeah, I personally, I found previews to be pretty buggy. I think I had high hopes for the Arctic. I had high hopes for the Compose beta. I think maybe it won't be until the sort of Arctic Fox beta that we see maybe a touch more stability on the preview side. But it seems like the Android team are investing a lot in it. I think they realized that the sort of quick previews and features like the live literals are really killer features, and it really has to work. Yeah, no, we have found it pretty buggy, unfortunately, and we don't use Showcase just yet. But I think once, it's partly because we already have the design app. If we didn't, then it would be probably more appealing. Maybe once we're majority Compose, it makes sense. I'm not sure. But...
yeah, it seems like the design app solves the problem for you, so that's cool.
Pretty much, yeah.
Let's see, what was the reason for modularizing when you are not dependent on data binding anymore, and the Compose components have such a low footprint?
Yeah, it's kind of just part of our kind of philosophy on modularization, where I think in modern Kotlin, it is absolutely fine to have a module that does one specific thing, and there isn't much in terms of cost for having an extra module. So if you can keep things super separate, then there's benefits in terms of making sure that you don't accidentally rely on the wrong thing, you don't end up writing spaghetti code, this kind of thing. You will also find compilation speed benefits. So if we had a monolithic design module which contained every composable in it, and we had to import that in every presentation module, you would see some build speed issues. Whereas if you're changing code in one very small module, whether it's view-based or compose-based, it shortens the compile time, basically. We're trying to make sure that incremental builds work as often as possible. So that was the thinking behind that. So
makes sense. Cool. I have one more question here. Let's see. Seems like it's more difficult now to offload work to a technical designer. How do you deal with that?
To a technical designer. Is this a designer that does the implementation for you, or?
I think so. Yeah, I'm also not completely clear on this.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean,
not
this
just
isn't.
XML
It's not
anymore,
something.
I guess. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, no, don't worry. It's absolutely fine. I mean, I think. I mean, I wouldn't say it's any harder than XML. I guess, if your components aren't stateful, which they most likely won't be, then I don't know. I suppose it probably is more complex than writing XML, but yeah, it's not a problem we've had to deal with. We aren't really big enough to have an engineer dedicated to the design system. We have thought about kind of alternatives that streamline some of this slightly, and one of the things that we're working on is a Figma plugin that will sync things like our colors to a separate repo, which we can depend on. So that will streamline some aspects of the design system. But yeah, I would love to work in a company that has a technical designer, but, or hire one rather. But yeah, we don't have one of those, so couldn't comment.
Cool. Yeah, would be interesting to have a technical designer just doing that kind of stuff.
Would be great. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Did you do any screenshot testing before Compose? Someone's asking.
No, we didn't. No, and truthfully, we haven't invested in it as much as I would like. Again, because we're a relatively small team, we didn't have that much bandwidth for it. So we've been a tiny bit lazy on that front. It is more of a kind of nice to have for us than an essential. But that's just the nature of the team that we're in, and the size and the number of features that we have to deliver this quarter. So.
Okay, I got 3 more questions for you, and then I'm going to round it up. Getting them nicely forwarded. So what about navigation with Compose? We are still using the navigation component until Compose navigation can be completely ready with features like transitions and animations. What do you recommend?
Yeah, really, really good question. And the thing is, this isn't it's not really a decision that we've managed to come to as a team just yet. I think what we did as a team, we didn't go down the single activity route because we had so much legacy stuff, and some of it still exists. What we did do is we created a navigation system which is based on suspending functions. You can call a suspending function from anywhere, and if you're starting for a result, straight suspending function that returns a value eventually. But under the hood, we abstracted it enough that the actual implementation of how the navigation happens is just an implementation detail. And on a module basis, you can swap it out with whatever you want. We haven't got around yet to using the Jetpack Compose navigation system. We have been meaning to investigate it. We just haven't looked at it seriously yet. I think the thing that is most appealing about it to me is the kind of URL style lookup deep linking, like deep linking great integration is really, really solid. So if that's a consideration for you, then I would probably recommend it. And I think more people will go that way. But it's a bit of a hard sell on my team. I think we were a little bit burnt by the previous NavGraph system, the sort of XML based one. And so we haven't really gone down that route yet. And I don't really have any recommendations one way or the other. I think you've got to see what works best for you. Actually, scrap that. There is one thing that you should bear in mind, I guess, if you're using the NavGraph. One of the reasons that we didn't investigate it or stopped looking at it was at the time you couldn't scope a view model to the life cycle of a composable, and that is a bit of a problem. And you can now, and you can do it with a hilt artifact, but I don't think you can do it in normal Dagger, which is what we're using. So we haven't gone down that route because the life cycle would be all messed up. So when that capability comes to Dagger, or we work out a way of doing it, then we'll investigate more seriously. But for now, we're pretty happy where we're at. So
cool. Right. Did your iOS colleagues, if you have any, do the same thing with Swift UI?
I mean, they've certainly invested really heavily in it, and it's funny because they started investing in it at a similar time to us. They were a bit less cautious than us, I think. Once they dropped, because I think if I remember correctly, Swift UI you couldn't support iOS 13 or something like that, and once they dropped that sort of minimum support, they just kind of went whole hog into it. So yeah, it's a bit of a different scenario because Swift UI is somewhat more stable, I think. But I mean, it is super interesting that we're able to tackle problems in pretty much the same way, and there is some value in that. And it's funny how web and Android and iOS all now have this kind of React type unidirectional data flow type declarative UI. It's just funny to see these platforms converging. I don't, because it wasn't as experimental, I don't think they approached it. I don't think they overthought it as much as we did. So
they could be less cautious, I guess. Let's see. Final question, a fun one to round up with. Are we sure this is not just hype-driven development?
Yeah, I'm more of a fan of TDD, Twitter-driven development. No, I mean, to an extent, you can certainly argue that it is hype-driven development, and we the thing is for us is that because we got to think about our architecture, we decided that we would invest in a bunch of things that were pretty cutting edge at the time. Like we were using Kotlin flows as core architecture when they were experimental, because we didn't want to get to a point where basically the writing was on the wall for our Xjava, I think, and the writing was on the wall for live data as well. I think Stateflow is likely. If live data is deprecated in 6 months, I wouldn't be surprised. So we were quite deliberately cutting edge because we wanted to not have to revisit this in 5 years and think, oh God, we've based everything on really ancient stuff. And I think it's pretty clear to me that Google are investing really. I think they've talked openly about this being the UI framework for at least 4 or 5 years. So we were happy to kind of take that risk. And I think the payoff in terms of being early adopters, getting to shape some of the conversation about Jetpack Compose, getting people interested in the company and in the team and in working for us has paid off. But yeah, I mean, there is an element of hype-driven development in there, but I think Jetpack Compose is here to stay, and will be for a while. So
cool, sounds good. All right, that's it for now. I want to thank you again for your talk and taking so much time to answer all these questions. Really good stuff.
And thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks so much. All right, with
Great,
that, see you around, and we'll follow you on Twitter.
Sounds good.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.